Hello there. Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. We are on our journey through Act 1, defining directing, and have introduced the flame paradigm, examined the F for facilitation/translation, and ruminated on L for leadership. If this is your first encounter with Deconstructing Directing, you can learn more about it either in the video description if you're watching this directly on YouTube, or via the library tab if you're watching this on our website. Along with this video, there are links to the PDF transcript and the podcast version of this content below, along with a few worksheets and other resources that you might find helpful in your journey as a director. The flame is burning, so let's hurry along to A, artistic insight and taste. The artistic work of directing is the part that most people use to define the role of a director. In the mind of many, we are to the actors as the conductor is to the orchestra. We guide and shape play by making aesthetic and artistic decisions in line with a vision that we are also responsible for creating, describing, and protecting throughout the process. And if that sounds like a lot of pressure on the director, that's because it is. In fact, it's so much pressure that it's the number one reason that artists tell me that they're afraid to direct or think that they could never be a director, because they're worried about or don't want all that pressure and expectation being placed on their shoulders. This is especially true in upstream theater spaces where the director is often wearing more than one hat, especially in schools or theaters with fewer resources. You'll notice that I've chosen to omit the word vision from this part of our flame paradigm, and that's because I think that the idea of directorial vision is A, poorly defined, B, far too unilateral for a collaborative process, and C, often results in unrealistic expectations, especially for new or less experienced directors in upstream theater spaces. I imagine that some people watching this might react quite strongly to the idea that a directorial vision isn't important. So let me clarify by saying that I don't think a director should be without a vision for what a production could or should be, but rather that there are other ways to describe how we can help shape and guide the collaborative process artistically that are more effective. However, in case I can't convince you of that, we'll come back around to the idea of vision at the end of this scene to discuss how we might modify our perspective on what a director's vision truly means for the artistic process. As the title of this scene suggests, the two terms that I prefer using over vision to describe the core of what we do artistically as directors are insight and taste. In my experience, these are the more specific components of what we typically mean when we talk about a director's vision. And learning to look at our work through these lenses can be an incredible tool for getting us out of a creative rut or helping us overcome anxiety about our artistic capabilities. Let's take a deeper look at each of them in turn. The Oxford Dictionary defines insight as, quote, the capacity to gain an accurate and deep intuitive understanding of a person or thing. The first way that focusing on insight rather than vision lightens the burden on directors is built right into the definition. It refers to the capacity to gain understanding, which frees us of the idea that we have to have it all figured out at the start. Which also highlights another truth about art. It's all derivative. Even when someone comes up with a new medium or art form, they aren't creating it in a vacuum. That new idea is born of life and an experience of the world that is dependent on other things to be born. Graham Wallas, a founder of the London School for Economics, wrote a very influential book in 1926 called The Art of Thought, where he defined 4 distinct phases that are essential in creating any new idea or thought. The first 3 of which he credits to the 19th century German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz. They are preparation, meaning investigating the problem from all sides, incubation, allowing time for our subconscious mind to process the investigation, illumination, the initial appearance of the new idea, and verification, testing the validity of the idea. I might also call this step distillation of the idea. So this deep intuitive understanding of a person or thing, insight, that our goal is to gain as directors might be as simple as these 4 steps: investigation, incubation, illumination, and verification or distillation. But Andrew, you might be saying, how do I get better at those things? Do I just have to luck into it? Well, if the answer was yes, that would make this video less than useful, wouldn't it? So, let's dive into each of these 4 steps. Investigation as the first step might seem obvious, but it seems to be a skill that feels less common than it used to. Not because people are less intelligent, but because we just don't have to do as much work to learn information. It's a few taps on our phone screens away from us. And it can be even harder because so many online tools we use, including search engines like Google, are trained by our prior behavior to provide us with resources and information that we already agree with. So we're more likely to believe a falsehood because, quote unquote, Google says. So let's start with the basics. As a director, what investigation needs to happen to help us develop artistic insight? Oh, except that isn't as basic as we might think. There are multiple schools of thought about how we ought to approach a text like a play or musical. There are those who believe that you should only look at what's written on the page and nothing else. Nothing about the writer, the time the work was written or set, none of it. This death of the author perspective sees the text as something separate from anything else, including the intention of the author. On the other end of the spectrum are those who see the text as inseparable from intention, context, and history. And of course, there are many who fall somewhere in the middle. So even just asking a question like, what should we investigate, is already more complicated than we might initially realize. However, I think that regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, there are some broad components of investigation that remain the same: observation, awareness, and intentionality. Observation is the act of perceiving something or someone with our senses. It is possibly to observe something and be unaware of it, especially if we're not paying attention to the context or don't expect it. I think of the classic experiment where an observer is tasked with watching a group of basketball players pass the ball back and forth and counting the number of times it changed hands. Afterward, the observer is asked about the gorilla that ran across the screen. Most of the time, the observer is confused, only to have the video rewound and played back showing a person in a gorilla suit clearly moving through the frame. But because the observer was so focused on counting the passes, their brain filtered extraneous information out. They observed everything on the screen, but were not aware of it. Awareness, then, is an extension of observation, a conscious cataloging of observation. I think of a common exercise I teach in theatrical mime classes: opening a door. Think about it right now. How do you open a door? Then you reach for the handle, you turn or pull or push the handle, depending on the type of door, and then you walk through, right? I would guess that most of us have a broad awareness of our actions when opening a door. But if I asked you how far your hand turned or how your body turned when grasping or releasing the handle, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me without going and doing it and paying close attention to those details. So, awareness is not all or nothing. It is a spectrum, just like the basketball and gorilla experiment above. This, then, is the importance of intentionality. When we are investigating something with the ultimate goal of developing insight, we have to be intentional in our observation and in our awareness. Early in our process, when we are first exploring our insight about a play or project, we might intentionally keep our observations and awareness broad, looking for larger ideas or themes. Later on, as we seek insight about the details of our work, we might be intentional about limiting our observation and awareness to the areas that we believe to be more crucial based on our understanding of the work. A significant part of investigation in this sense is also understanding our own biases. We'll get more into this in a later act, but in a sense, the best directors are those who investigate themselves with observation, awareness, and intentionality in addition to the work that they are hoping to create. The next step in our insight development is the simplest, but that doesn't mean it is easy. We need to let what we have learned incubate. My dad used to describe this process as letting the librarian in his head do their work, an image I still think of to this day. Insight is not something that can be forced, especially when we are looking for that initial insight about how we might approach a play or other type of work most effectively. However, the incubation phase is rarely a phase of inaction or stillness, at least not in its entirety. In fact, as we do our investigative work, the first things we learn begin to incubate as soon as we learn them. Now, stillness can absolutely be valuable in this process, but as someone who is neurodivergent, sitting still has never been my strong suit. Instead, I find that often the corollary to stillness for me is intentionally separating myself from the work. Putting down the script, walking away from the computer, turning off our phones, all of these things can be forms of stillness that allow incubation of our insight to develop. We might also find it helpful to incubate our ideas by submerging our mind in other forms of creativity. I love going to an art museum when I'm mulling over a theatrical question or problem in my mind, or listening to a favorite musical artist, or intentionally trying to discover a new one. Now, to be clear, investigation never really stops in our artistic process, and neither does incubation. It's merely the focus of these activities that shift. That said, it can be helpful to identify for yourself the ways in which you are investigating and incubating at any given point in the process, especially if you feel creatively stuck. The moment of illumination that hopefully follows investigation and incubation is an exciting one. It can feel like a jolt of electricity and excitement, that aha moment that any teachers watching this almost certainly love to see in their students. I often describe it as a lock that clicks open, kind of like in an escape room when a hidden door to another room appears out of seemingly nowhere. This is especially true when we've been working on the problem or question for a while, and it can be tempting to immediately grab the answer and dive into the work. But the final step to developing insight is absolutely crucial: verification, or as I like to call it in an artistic sphere, distillation. Just because we have an aha moment doesn't mean that we have considered all sides to the idea. And if we become too possessive of it now, we risk missing important considerations that can have significant impact. So, how do we verify or distill an insight after the moment of illumination? I generally go through a few steps, though they're not normally as discreet as I'm about to make them sound. That said, following these steps may be helpful for those who are still uncertain of their own insight, so feel free to use them as they fit your needs. First, I look at the internal logic of the story. Does this idea hold considering the given circumstances? Take Hamlet, a show that most of us probably know, even if it's just by way of The Lion King. If I had a moment of illumination that perhaps the play could be performed such that King Hamlet didn't die, he instead killed his brother and adopted his identity. A bit of a bonkers idea, and one that might be very difficult to verify or distill given the actual text Shakespeare presents us with. However, that might be your goal, to do something totally bonkers with the story. So, second, I ask myself how I will explain and justify the insight to others. After all, theater is a collaborative medium. We can't do it alone. As part of this process, I might try to anticipate concerns my collaborators might have, not because I'm trying to forecast their responses, but because by trying to look at the insight from another perspective, it either helps me strengthen my commitment to the insight or demonstrates its weaknesses. Finally, I ask myself how this insight aligns with my values as an artist. As mentioned above, these are usually not sequential thought processes, but all tangled up together. It could be argued that this is the most important distillation or verification of an insight. But one of my artistic values centers around how I can be conscious of our differences as human beings and become an accomplice to those whose differences often leave them on the margins. That means for me, any insight I might have must empower and support those voices. But our values as artists could also include questions about your relationship with the text, authorship and intent, and even the styles of theater that you're drawn to. We've covered a lot so far, but I promised you an introduction to artistic insight and taste. So let's touch briefly on artistic taste before we close. We're going to spend a lot more time looking at how we develop our taste as directors in Act 2, so hopefully this will whet your palates for upcoming videos. Artistically speaking, taste is often seen as a question of aesthetic preferences. When we see art or design that aligns with our aesthetic preferences, we often say that the artist or designer has good taste, and when we don't find a work aesthetically pleasing, we might question the bad taste of the artist. Sometimes taste, in this context, can also refer to the social acceptability of a piece of art. Profanity or nudity, for instance, are often said to be, quote, in bad taste in some communities, while that which does not challenge or provoke the moral norms of a viewer might be considered to be in good taste. But taste has another definition, the literal sense of taste that we possess on our tongue and in our nose. If you ask a chef how they make food that tastes good, many will discuss the components of flavor that we experience: saltiness, sweetness, bitterness, sourness, and umami or savoriness. The best food finds a balance between these different components, and different chefs create different balances. In this instance, balance doesn't mean that all the flavors are equal. On the contrary, sometimes a balanced dish is very sweet forward or umami forward, but it's not all or nothing. There are other flavors to help balance it out. But in addition to these literal flavors, there are a lot of things that impact our taste beyond flavor. The appearance of food, its texture, the environment we eat it in, who we eat it with, and more can all impact our enjoyment of a dish or meal. Our artistic taste as directors is not dissimilar to the taste of a chef, with a lot of different elements to play around with. Think of every job that has a designer, actor, or director involved, and that's a different element that impacts our work and therefore our taste. Like many chefs, directors often develop a signature style or approach to the work of theater, but that doesn't mean that they are limited to them. Over the 20 years I've been directing, I have developed a reputation for acting-centric direction. To my taste, the most delicious theater requires the most authentic, motivated, present acting possible. Generally speaking, in my work, everything else works to support that central flavor. And that's not to say that I don't care about the other elements. I do. I mean, theater with nothing but actors standing around talking gets quite uninteresting after a while. And many of those other elements help support the actors in their work. I'm particularly fond of lighting design. So, taking the time to examine and define our taste as directors allows us to identify the flavors we are most drawn to. In a sense, it's part of our investigation work as we develop our artistic insight. If you're a director with less experience, you may not know yet what flavors you are drawn to working with, and that's okay too. The good news is that the elements you enjoy working with are often, though not always, very similar to the elements you enjoy as an audience member as well. Down below, we've created a theater flavors worksheet that you can print out and take with you to the next show you see. It'll help guide you in identifying what elements stood out to you and which faded into the background. Once we have a better understanding of our own taste, we can communicate that more clearly to our teams, which can help engender trust and confidence in our approach. As I've mentioned in previous scenes, my brain doesn't look at costuming the same way it does in other elements, so that's why I bring in amazing costume designers to work with, just like a chef who's great at savory dishes might bring in a pastry chef to focus on desserts. Of course, knowing our taste doesn't mean that we always have the tools to create work that aligns with our taste, but we're going to cover those in much more detail in later acts, so hang in there with us. And with that, we are now more than halfway through our flame paradigm for directing. Can you believe it? If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I will see you again when you are ready to dive into Act 1, Scene 5, Management. Keep stoking those flames, my friends.